Hi there, and welcome back to 19th Century Art. In this lecture, we're going to examine the British arts and crafts movement, which is a broad umbrella term to a lot of different artists and their work in the mid to late 19th century. The Pre-Raphelite Brotherhood and the Aestheticists were just two of the different groups that identified with this movement. The Pre-Raphelite Brotherhood, which roughly went from 1848 to 1853, while it was a short-lived movement, really identified a growing discomfort with industrialization in Britain, which had been polluting the skies and corrupting the cities with these massive factories. And it didn't take much for people to realize how denigrating and dehumanizing the work of the Industrial Revolution was. And so the Pre-Raphelite Brotherhood imagined art that would lead us away from this growing demand for industrialization back to a time of craftspeople who really cared about their work as tradesmen. And so the word Pre-Raphelite is referring to Raphael, the Renaissance painter, and the art that was really happening in the medieval times. And so in a way, this speaks to a need to get back to a more essential relationship between the artist and society, and to try and break away from this highly industrialized mechanisms that were surrounding society today, and remind people of this more richer, deeper spiritual connection that art enjoyed in the distant past. So part of this was an inspiration from the Romantics, who were excited about the Gothic period, the art of the medieval times, and it was to try and capture this sentiment of having a spiritual connection again to nature, and that nature and the natural world would have this very important aspect in their work. So again, we see some of the characteristics of the neoclassical, this desire to look at the ancient past, maybe not as ancient as, say, Greece and Rome, but a way to get back to that ideal. But it's also deeply steeped in this romantic idea and of the artist's vision and a spiritual connection to art. The idea was to have really genuine ideas to express, to study nature attentively, to sympathize what is direct and serious and heartfelt in previous art, and to get away from the conventional and the commercial. And to that end, they wanted to produce good pictures of very high quality, but they didn't want to put their names to it. They signed everything PRB, and that was their way of identifying as a group, and they expressed this manifesto. And it was really a very distinct group of artists: William Holman Hunt, John Everett Millay, and as we see here, Dante Gabriel Rossetti in his painting of Proserpine. Unfortunately, this idealism didn't last a whole long. As these artists became successful or not, they felt the extraordinary pressure to apply their own names again to their work. And that was part of the success of the Pre-Raphelite Brotherhood, was its destruction. So here we have William Dyce, Religion, the Vision of Sir Galahad and his company. So going back to these medieval stories of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table and the mysticism associated with the Holy Grail, we see the type of conventions, heavily ornate frames, the style of the lettering, the clothing, all very reminiscent of this medieval time. And it has a certain awkwardness to it, very posed and very theatrical qualities. It's not concentrated on light of the moment, but on a flawless rendition of surface appearances. So the delicacy and the qualities of the materials, the puffiness of the clouds, the luminosity, all of this is part of this desire to break free from the oppressive realism and rational thinking that was coming with the Enlightenment. Shakespeare plays an important role in the PRB, the Pre-Raphelite Brotherhood. John Everett Millais, probably one of his most powerful painting, is a depiction from a scene in Hamlet. It's not actually a scene that is depicted, but is described off stage, where Ophelia, in her madness, gets swept up in the current and is floating downstream, sort of oblivious to her fate. She's been collecting all these weeds and flowers, and now they've dragged her down to her watery death. And so this is this just exquisite, richly detailed painting of this natural scene, this tragic moment of Ophelia swept downstream. And the surface texture of this is really extraordinary. It really gives you this incredible density of the fabric that's enveloped her and the flowers. There's a wonderful color to this painting. And notice how he frames the painting, how he's cropped the upper right and left of the picture to give it this idea of a kind of altarpiece, where you have this place of natural reverence for someone who has sacrificed themselves for their love, who has sacrificed themselves to nature. John Everett Millais was another one of these very successful painters. Here we see a really lovely depiction of the family of Christ in his house with his parents, imagining a scene that's sort of full of symbolic import. Of Christ here as this young child now being coddled by Mary and tended to his father Joseph, and the little Christ child has a boo-boo on his palm. It's sort of anticipating his future crucifixion. And over on the right we see John the Baptist carefully bringing in a bowl of water to tend to the wound. It all has the sense of this wonderfully staged. It's beautifully natural, but it's also very formal in a way. It's just a lovely way in which everything feels just perfectly in its place, in this sort of certainty. And I think that's what really attracted them to this medieval art, was the certainty of it, that it wasn't problematic. It didn't raise more questions than it could answer. And it has in its grasp the meanings that hold true value. And I really feel like there is a reactionary quality to the PRB that really has to be understood, that they weren't going forward with the intent that this is going to be the future. They were like, we got to go back. We've taken a wrong turn. We need to find our way back to this ideal time. Now, the arts and crafts movement was, as I said, a large umbrella for a lot of people with different agendas. And these artists were considered some of the major movers and shakers. They were not all artists. John Ruskin was primarily an art historian. William Morrison was primarily a designer who also wrote theory and novels. And Walter Kane worked in children's book illustration. So there's a whole lot of different people with different ideas about what their art was, working together with this idea about craftsmanship. And this is the thing that we needed to get back to, because this was where humanity's soul lay. And they were very ideological about this, that this was something that was really going to save mankind. They wanted to bring art to the people, crushed by industrialization, and return to well-crafted idea. They wanted to lift up the souls of people who they felt were oppressed by this industrialization. Now let's start looking at the work first of William Morris. He is a real giant in the design world. And if you may not known it, you've probably seen his work. He was famous for his designs of wallpaper and furniture and stained glass. And he really brings the vocabulary of the medieval time into the modern world. He allows it this kind of exuberance and energy that really makes it a popular movement. Now, the paradox here is William Morris made brilliant, beautiful things that ordinary people really couldn't afford. And the craftsmanship he used was so fine. But he was using modern technology to print and produce and generate this art. So in some ways it looks medieval, in some ways it copies medieval forms and ideas, but he's also using a great deal of cutting-edge technology to make it all work. Now here we see a wonderful example of that, his Morris chair, an adjustable back chair designed by Philip Webb for Morris. And it's a lovely chair. It really speaks to the medieval time, but it's also very modern. Look at those wonderful little metal casters on it. They didn't have those in medieval times. And there's this wonderful way in which he's taken these design elements, which are actually beautifully done. There's twisting things that would have required enormous amount of labor to produce in the medieval times. He's able to do because he's got these fancy machines. All right. So in a sense, it's hearkening back to this medieval time. It's also using this new technology to inform a new aesthetic that denies the technology. It's kind of funny that way. Now, William Morris was also a tremendous writer. And he was also a printmaker, and he worked to bring back this sort of older style lettering and design work. The Nature of the Gothic, this was an essay by John Ruskin that really celebrated the ideas of this arts and crafts movement, and William Morris gives Ruskin's essay this absolutely lavish treatment that really deeply steeps you into the culture and the ideas of the arts and crafts movement. Morris's press was called Kelmscott Press, and they did a number of just absolutely stunning works from the medieval times. Chaucer, as you see here, from 1896. And the illustrations were just unbelievable, wonderfully rich, evocative, sort of getting us back to this idea of wood type and beautifully inlaid. But again, it's a modern press, but it's creating an art object that speaks powerfully to the medieval aesthetic. William Morris designed over 600 wallpapers, textiles, embroideries, 150 stained glass windows, 3 typefaces, and around 650 borders and ornaments for this press. So the man was incredibly prolific and hugely influential in the design world. And that's not all. In his spare time, he was writing these fantasy novels, one of which was called The Well at the World's End. This was probably one of the more popular ones, published in 1896. William Morris's Well at the World's End is a medieval tale, but it's in style, but it's very modern in its relationships and its struggles. And so it feels like you're reading a medieval romance, but you're actually getting a modern novel. And this was a really novel idea. I mean, it was very original way to kind of create this fantasy world based on the medieval structures. Well, I can tell you, William Morris was hugely influential on 2 very important authors in the 20th century. If you're ever familiar with J.R.R. Tolkien or the author of the Narnia series, C.S. Lewis, they were both deeply indebted to William Morris's idea. And that's where they got this notion of a medieval fantasy from. In fact, they were so enamored of William Morris, they even brought in many of the names of the characters from William Morris. There is a King Gandalf, and there's a King Peter, and there's a quick white horse named Silverfax. So this is an extraordinary bit of literature. These books are available free online. I highly recommend you read them. They are an absolute riot. I really thoroughly enjoyed digging into William Morris's fantasy medieval fiction. Tiffany Stained Glass picked up on the arts and crafts movement in the United States, was enormously influential. They have a stunning example of his work at the Indianapolis Museum of Art. Louis Comfort Tiffany really understood that you wanted to create a brand, that people were buying your brand, and that you would provide them with not just stained glass, but also the furniture, the design, the wallpaper in this new decor that you were getting into. And this is how you were able to sell things to people. Because if you were just buying a chair to get a chair, you would get one chair and then you would be done with it. But if you were trying to match a decor in your whole house, different rooms, different themes, then you have a market for continually selling and reselling people something they already have. Getting back to Britain and the art there is an American artist who lived much of his life in Britain, James Abbott McNeill Whistler, just call him Whistler, and he was a very provocative artist. He wanted to really shake people out of their complacency, and he was very combative. So he actually wrote an essay called The Gentle Art of Making Enemies as a way of, taking on this mantle of the artist as provocateur, the person who's not going to just show you a work of art and make you feel good about yourself because it conforms to what you expect art to look like. He is going to shake you and make you wake up. Looking at his painting, Symphony in White, number 1, The White Girl, well, that looks kind of like a pretty straightforward description of what you're looking at, a girl in white who is white. And he did a whole series of paintings about this woman in white in these settings, these portraits. And what's subversive about this is that when people came to see art exhibits, they expected to see a narrative. They expected to see, like we saw earlier in the Pre-Raphelite Brotherhood, these artists had a message. They were referring to a story. And James Whistler believed that art was just good enough for itself. It didn't need a story. It didn't have to refer to anything. But he deliberately set this up to make it look like it did. Okay, so this woman's wearing white. Is she getting married? What's going on? Why is she on this fierce animal skin? And what's going on? Like there's this herb in her hand. All of this would have been coded symbolism that viewers would have tried to wrestle with. But Whistler's just laughing at them because there is no meaning. He's just made a pretty picture, as he called it, a symphony in white. And you're supposed to appreciate it just as that, a picture about the color white. As he said in his essay, The Gentle Art of Making Enemies, art should be independent of all claptrap, should stand alone, and appeal to the artistic sense and eye or ear without confounding this with emotions entirely foreign to it, as devotion, pity, love, patriotism, and the like. So art is not in the service of other art or other stories. It is entirely in the service of itself. Art is a purpose of communicating a visual experience. And this is where we get the idea of art for art's sake. And Whistler was a part of this new group called the Aestheticists, which is kind of a tongue twister here. Aestheticism, aesthetics, the visual qualities of something. This is the thing that all it stands for. The artist is not there as a beacon to the past, as a way of getting us to something that we have lost or forgotten. It is in the moment, about the here and now. It's this painting in front of you. Just look at the picture. Stop thinking about it. Experience it for what it is. He had his own fancy artistic signature that he used to brand his works. So he was, as I said, a rather notorious character for picking fights and being a contrarian. And yet his most famous painting, the painting that if you've ever heard of Whistler and you know of Whistler's mother, and yet that's not what this painting is called. And the history and the story of this painting is really quite extraordinary. James Whistler was back in the U.S. and he was visiting his family and he had set up an appointment for a model to come that he could paint, and she didn't show up. So in desperation, he brought his mother in, begged her, please sit for a portrait I need to paint. And so he set this up in this very formal, flat way, and he gets this combinations of grays and blues, just delicate. He calls this arrangement in gray and black, number 1. Okay, no, almost nobody remembers that title because everyone, if you ever heard anyone talk about this, it's Whistler's mother. And that seems to be the subject of the painting, right? And that's what we would expect it to be. But Whistler's saying, no, it's not about my mom. Get away from my mom. It has nothing to do with her. It's all about color in space. And it is this arrangement. It's this beautiful formal arrangement. It's so still and yet it's so lively. The decorations on the curtains, the surface of her black dress, the delicate lace that comes down off her shoulders. All this is just beautifully done. It's a masterful painting and it's wonderfully rich in color. But the thing is, we are so narrative driven. We look at this and we go, oh, he loves his mama. Well, really? Not that much. He never spent any time in the U.S. He was trying to get away as far and as fast as he possibly could. So, when we look at arrangement in gray and black, give poor Whistler a break. Don't think about his mom. Just enjoy the picture. So, probably Whistler's most famous attempt at communicating aestheticism was a speech he gave on February 20th, 1885, which became known as Whistler's 10 o'clock. And he said everyone came to jeer and laugh at him, but instead he really made them think. And he said that he attacks the Pre-Raphelite Brotherhood for this idea that art was better in the past. And he said, no, it's not better in the past. We have not decayed. Art is art. It doesn't change like that. It doesn't get better or worse historically. Thus, the people have acquired the habit of looking not at a picture, but through it at some human fact that shall or shall not, from a social point of view, better their mental or moral state. Like the art itself is this vehicle towards some other seemingly more important goal. And he was saying, no, it's not. It's right here in the picture. It's just this picture right now. Indeed, it is high time that we cast aside the weary weight of responsibility and compartnership. And I know that in no way do our virtues minister it to its worth. In no way do our vices impede its triumph. So, stop thinking about the artist, stop thinking about the story that the picture is referring to, and just experience it. Here is a painting that got him into a lot of trouble. Okay, it's a very quickly done nocturne in black and gold, a firework display off the River Thames, a falling rocket, 1875. This gets into trouble because the art critic, John Ruskin, really went to town and attacked it. Now, Ruskin was a favorite of the Pre-Raphelite Brotherhood. He probably was well aware of Whistler's opinion of his favorite artists. And Ruskin, who really enjoyed Turner, who has a very sketchy style as well, Ruskin went to town on Whistler's painting. I have seen and heard much cockamamie impudence before now, but never expected to hear a coxcomb ask 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint into the public's face. He just thought this was just a mess of paint on the surface of the canvas and had absolutely no redeeming value. And how could he possibly charge 200 guineas for something that only took him a few minutes to make? Now, interestingly, in his defense, when this went to court, Whistler sued Ruskin for libel, which is a very serious matter in Britain. And it went to court. And when Whistler was presented with that argument, well, how long did it take you to paint this? And do you think, having spent so little time on it, that it's worth that much money? And Whistler simply replied, it took me 30 years to paint this. All the experience of all my days have led up to this picture. You can't just do this in 30 minutes. It takes a lifetime of study and practice, which is really the right answer. Because why are we paying artists like they're factory workers, right? This is a work of art which represents a level of engagement and a seriousness of understanding about the process of art that far exceeds the amount of time it takes to actually make it. Even though Whistler won the libel suit, he was only awarded $1, which was insult to injury because he had spent so much on legal representation. It's at this time in Paris that a group of artists came in to experience Japanese art for the first time. It's a book of Hokusai's manga. Remember those quick sketchy drawings they were doing? Well, these had been packed into a book of porcelains that had been shipped from Japan to France for this exhibition. And the artists saw this sort of extra packing material that had been stuffed into the edges of this shipping box. And they were like, oh my goodness, this is absolutely stunning. They looking at Hokusai and just absolutely dumbfounded by the brilliance of his sketches, his drawings, the vitality of it, the freshness of it. It just spoke so powerfully to them. And so this was the spark that launched Japonisme. This was the beginning of that. Now, the artist Felix Bracamont, he goes to the Sèvres porcelain and he says, I've got some great ideas. Grabs bits and pieces of Hokusai's drawings, the birds, the wind, the lightning, the bamboo, and creates this fanciful design that is then printed onto a porcelain. Of course, because porcelain is kind of associated with Asia and this sort of Asian design. Now, Hokusai never did designs for porcelain, but this is how they envisioned this way of making a new kind of Japanese style art. And no one ever done this before, right? Like looked at Japanese art and thought, wow, that's really great. That's incredible. Okay, so 1867, this is the beginning of Japanisme, and it becomes an extremely big fad. At the Paris in 1856, they see this and they're like, oh my goodness, this is an incredible new art direction. It's so obviously beautiful. It's so obviously aesthetic and rich in design, but it has none of the rules and ideas that have based design for the 2,000 years in the West. It's so original and so obviously exquisite. And so people went into Japanisme as novices. They came into it looking at it like how wonderful, not knowing anything about it, but just being attracted to it by its exquisite beauty. And it's this kind of attention to Japanese art where it's Japanese art without any context for it whatsoever, right? No idea what it means or what it comes from or why they made it or how it was used back in Japan. No one had any idea, but they just immediately looked at it and just thought, how exquisite, how beautiful. And so for Oscar Wilde, this was the most wonderful thing because this is what he and Whistler have been arguing about all this time. Was that we can just look at something and not know anything about it and enjoy it. And so Japanisme was, in a sense, the aestheticists at their own game. Sure, it was from Japan, but what's Japan? As Oscar Wilde would say, the whole of Japan is pure invention. There's no such country. There's no such people. The Japanese people are simply a mode of style and exquisite fancy of art. So what he's saying is, yes, of course, there's a real country called Japan and there are real people and there's a real culture and a real history and all that. But to us, to the people of Europe and Paris especially at this time, Japan was a nothing. It was a blank slate. They had no idea what it could possibly be about. So when you held a Japanese object, it revealed itself to you. The touch is all you needed to know. Having a feel for the art, a sensory innocence, a sensual and sexual immediacy and self-gratification. And this is from The Hare with the Amber Eyes, A Hidden Inheritance by Edmund de Waal. He talks about how his family became obsessed with these objects in Paris at this time. And he traces its history back to himself, a British ceramicist in the 21st century. Now, Whistler went on to go head over heels into Japanese art with a project for a very wealthy industrialist and who had this huge collection of porcelains, and he wanted a room to show off his collection. And so Whistler went to work and designed this massive installation with all this gold trim and gold paintings. And he worked this all up in this design to appeal to this new Japanisme. This incredible room is on display permanently at the Freer Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And if you're ever in Washington, D.C., I highly recommend you make the trip to the Freer Gallery and see it. It is absolutely stunning. And you can see the pride of the place is a painting by James McNeill Whistler, The Princess from the Land of Porcelain. And here Whistler is adopting the Japanese style. He's brought this woman into a kimono holding a Japanese fan with a propped up folding screen, and he's given it all the accoutrement of the Japanese aesthetics. You see how he's been influenced by what we call in the ukiyo-e beauty prints, the woodblock prints. Notice the flatness. Notice the use of patterning. All of these are things that Whistler was attracted to, these aesthetic qualities of the Japanese print that he's bringing into his own painting. His painting, of course, is much more modeled, and it shows light and dark in a way that the Japanese weren't interested in. But it does give us this wonderful aesthetic characteristics of the Japanese print now entering into Western art. Going back to the room, there was a terrible battle between the industrialist Leyland, who commissioned this work, and Whistler. Leyland had gone away on vacation while Whistler worked, and Whistler had just gone absolutely crazy, spending some 2,000 guineas, the equivalent of $200,000 in tricking out this room. And Leland was just over the moon, furious, because all that green surface, that was patented leather that he painted over. So all the leather that had been applied to the walls at great expense were suddenly just a blank canvas for Whistler to paint on. And it's really shocking that he would take such liberties. And he got into this terrible battle with Leyland about the price and his own payment. And Leyland refused to pay him. He said, I'm not going to pay you for this. This has cost way too much money. And so he told Whistler that if you ever cross my doorway again, I will have you horsewhipped. In retribution in art, Whistler came up with a painting to speak back to his stingy patron, and did this of Leyland as the Gold Scab from 1879. And we see him as this kind of monstrous figure playing over his green piano, sitting on top of his house, looking like a peacock in his denizen. No discussion of the ideas of aestheticism is complete without examining the extraordinary life of Oscar Wilde. Now, Oscar Wilde was a writer, a playwright, a poet, essayist, and he was really the heart and soul of the aesthetic movement. He led a lavish life. He came from a privileged elite society, and he wrote in this wonderful way. People say he was a brilliant conversationalist, and he just had witticisms all the time for every occasion. He was just enormously entertaining and a fascinating person beside. He actually did a really incredible tour of the United States where he traveled around giving lectures, and he went out west, and he even went down into mine shafts and talked poetry to the miners down in the coal mines of the U.S. I mean, really an extraordinary human being out there looking at things. And he writes this really brilliant essay at the height of aestheticism in 1891, The Decay of Lying. The problem is with painting, it's being too honest. It's trying to be too sincere. And he says that's not in the character of art. Art is a lie. It never expresses anything but itself. Life imitates art far more than art imitates life. That the primacy of art in its own existence, in its own way of being something in the world. And this idea of lying, the telling of beautiful, untrue things, is the proper aim of art. That we're not trying to convince you of something being real or true, but we're trying to let you experience something completely separate from your life and your world as you know it today. It's a lie. It doesn't exist in any way except as an illusion there to propel you outside the truth of your own existence. Oscar Wilde got into a passionate love affair with a young man who was an elite of society, and this got him into great trouble. The father of this young man accused Wilde of sodomy, which is a very serious crime. And as I said, libel laws are very serious in Britain. So Oscar Wilde, against everyone's wishes, sued the father of Lord Alfred Douglas, which was his lover, for libel, and went to court. And Oscar Wilde sincerely believed he could convince everyone of his innocence, because he was just such a wonderful conversationalist. He could convince you of anything. And he only convinced himself that he was innocent as well, when she certainly was not. And all kinds of evidence came out. And so he loses the libel suit. And because of the evidence that is brought up in court, he's brought back to another trial. And there he is convicted of sodomy. And for that, he is sentenced to prison and hard labor. And here he undergoes a very brutal and painful stint in oppressive prison. It's been painted in a sort of cheery yellow, but I can assure you it didn't look like this when he was there. He was sent there for 2 years, having been found guilty of gross indecency in 1895. He would come out, but only live 2 years longer. And it's sad because in this time he writes some of his most beautiful essays, De Profundis. He says, "There's not a single wretched man in this wretched place, along with me, who does not stand in symbolic relation to the very secret of life, for the secret of life is suffering."